Okay, so we're going to start off our afternoon segment talking about enhanced nutrient management. So there's a couple reasons that we want to talk about this. Specifically, I really want to talk about agronomic rate. So one of the more important things that you can do for limiting the potential for manure to go somewhere is to start by putting it on at the rate that is needed. And we call this agronomic rate. Sorry. Specifically what this is, and you've probably heard about this in your record keeping or otherwise, no matter what kind of crop you grow, you've probably heard about put on a quote agronomic rate. And what this is it's the application of nutrients. And we typically balance via nitrogen, no matter what we're putting out. That tends to be what we focus on, to supply crop nutrient needs to achieve a key word here, a realistic yield. So it's really important to know what your yields should be so you can be realistic about using that value to calculate the rest of this. And that's realistic yield and minimize the movement of nutrients to natural resources. This can be air. So this is volatilization, it's groundwater, so that's leaching. If it's in the soil and our plants aren't taking it up, it can go down once we get rain, or it can be via surface water. If we've got too much out on the surface, it's not getting into our soil fast enough. We have lost ways on that surface. If rain comes, or if you just put too much volume out there at once, it's gonna run off if your soil can't take it in. So really thinking about this agronomic rate. So it's essentially what your crop needs minus what your soil can already provide, either from you've already put manure out and it's becoming available, or if you're a historical manure applicator, your soil already has a lot of what we call organic nitrogen in there. Your manure is composed of two nitrogen fractions, organic nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. Most of the crops we grow really want nitrate. So when you put that your kind of two forms of nitrogen from manure out on the soil converts that into nitrate. The ammonium part converts kind of fast. That organic nitrogen takes a long time. It can take years before the soil can convert it over. So if you've been putting manure out for, let's say, 10 years, you're already to a cycle. Even though you're putting more out every year and more is converting every year, you've kind of come to what we call like an equilibrium. So your soil is supplying nitrogen every year just by its natural processes if you've had manure go out to it on a regular basis. So that's why we have this. It's very important, this soil nutrients available components there. That's why you test your manure, or you test your soil at the end of the year. What's your fall nitrate? That just says how well did I do trying to match up these things. But what our plant needs, what's available, that's how much manure nutrient you should be putting out. And this doesn't mean you just do this once. You should do this holistically for the year. If I want 5-ton grass, I need X amount of nitrogen out for the year. But then you have to do it for every single manure application you put out there, no matter the crop. Corn, even if it's just once, maybe you do a split twice. It's going to be a lot easier than grass if you're putting it out there 5 or 6 times during the year. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The first thing really to think about and concentrate though, and I always want you to put your brain in the right place, especially this time of year. Some people might be getting a little nervous, your storage just getting a little tight and it's getting a little high, and you really want the weather to clear up so you can get that stuff out of there, versus some other folks, you have enough storage, you're pretty comfortable, and your thought process is, where's my crop need? So I really like to differentiate between when you can be calm and thoughtful and think about, what does my crop need for this year? How can I maximize my crop production for the best forage I can grow without having any environmental impact? That's nutrient management. That's agronomic. If you're just trying to get volume out on a field because your storage is really tight and that's all you're thinking about, that's waste management. And I use that word waste very purposefully because your manure is not a waste product if you're utilizing it. And you should never consider it a waste product. It is a very, very valuable resource on your farm. It's an incredible thing that you produce that improves our soil, grows our crops, and actually really improves water movement in a positive way through our soils by increasing organic matter and tilth and allowing infiltration rate to go through. So manure is actually a very, very beneficial substance in our soil environment. Please use it that way, right? So the more tools and more information we can give you that you're thinking about it in that way, the better your utilization will be, the better your crops are going to be. And if we put that all in one big picture of everything you've heard today, most likely we're going to improve or decrease the few water quality problems we still have out there in this realm. So it's really moving in a positive direction. I also want to point out here, this is a slide I often put up, and it very much mimics that handout that you have and the 4 steps. So what do I do thoughtfully before manure goes out? And I always end up at these meetings telling you guys about field risk maps and manure spreading advisory, etc. And I always skip over that first one and that agronomic rate calculation, like you figure that out. Now I'm going to talk to you about how we minimize risk. Well, today I'm just going to talk to you about this first part because it is a part that we seem to skip over quite a bit, but it has extreme importance. And there's a few ways that I specifically want to talk to you about this, that just to get your brain right. We're not going to do math today per se, but I want to give you all the things that you can control and aware of the things you can't control that are going to change this number, but that you can be thinking about throughout the year to make on-the-fly adjustments to make sure that you are sticking to that agronomic rate for every application, no matter the crop, no matter the time of year. So some things to consider when using manure. And again, manure is a pretty awesome substance, but it's also kind of complicated, amazingly. There's a lot we have to think about when it comes down manure. And even though, you know, the majority of you are dairy producers and all your cows are pooping, the product you put out on the field is different between every single one of your facilities. And that's because what do you feed your cows? So nutrients in is nutrients out. What you put in has to be just the right amount so that we don't have excess above what we have coming out. How do you handle your manure? Those things are going to change. So I want to talk about a few key pieces here. So manure type, solid versus liquid manure versus if you do any type of a composting process. Difference between species. Technology impacts on the composition of manure if you separate solids. All of those things very greatly and significantly impact the nutrient value of your end product. Don't assume you put a separator in this year that the rates you put out the year before is the same thing you can put out now. You've totally changed your product. You've taken solids out of there. Those solids have a lot of all that kind of really organic nitrogen fraction. You've probably taken out more phosphorus than you realize. So that liquid fraction minus solids has a totally different NPK value now. So we need to think about it different. And or the rate that you put out has got to change a lot, right? Or if we look at your heifers, if you've got them separate from your cows, really different manure composition there. A much more balanced nitrogen to phosphorus in heifers versus our dairy cows, right? So all of those different things. Then you move even to horses or pigs or whatever. Really, really, really different. So something that has to be considered. The manure nutrient concentration. This changes a lot through the year. You may just take one manure sample and then assume that's valid for everything you apply from, you know, February through October, and it's not the case. Think about what your manure looks like and feels like and handles like now versus what that feels like and handles like in September. The difference there is all the water you've collected through the winter. So if you're putting on 10,000 gallons per acre at both of those times, you could have about half the amount of nitrogen that you're putting out this time of year than you will at the end of the year. The kind of hard part about that is if you're applying to grass, your grass needs twice as much nitrogen now as it does in September. So it's one of those really hard things we have to deal with is how do we put out a higher concentration but a lower volume now and more volume of water, less concentration, getting at the end of summer into early fall. It's a really tough one. Technology is the only way to really help with that, or do you pull from the bottom versus the top of your manure, agitating? There's a few of those things that you can do in order to really put your brain in. I want low volume right now. I want high concentration because your grass is about to start warming up and just catapult, and it can take 2 to 3 months for the nitrogen in your manure to become plant available. Those soil microbes have to wake up from this cold winter and start working on that. By the end of summer, there are these highly productive little factories of like conversion within weeks. It's warm, your soil's really active, so we really have to continue to concentrate or think about that. Your manure, your nitrogen fraction in particular on a gallon basis is going to be really different January, February, March than it will be July, than it will be September, October. You need to have tests throughout the year. You can space one if you have one test a year. Take it in February one year, take it June the next, take it September the year after. If you haven't changed cow numbers or diet year to year in that specific time of year, it's not going to have a huge difference. So just start staggering those tests, and so that you have an idea if you don't want to take every month, every time you apply throughout a year. So there are ways to work around that, but really important for you to know. Nutrient availability, when nutrients will be available based on conversion rate in the soil. So that's what I've talked about. This time of year, when it's below 40°F in the soil, your microbes are asleep. They're wishing they were in Mexico, they're hibernating. But when our soil starts warming up, especially 65, 70 degrees, oh man, they are super productive, really, really active. They're just converting everything very quickly. So that matters to us. When your soil gets really hot, rare around here, but really hot, really dry, same thing happens. They start kind of taking a siesta because it's a little too hot and dry. They don't have enough moisture to keep themselves active. So there are those differences as your conversion rate when you put manure out. Think of it, it's a couple months now, but it's a couple weeks in the summer. That's why we oftentimes, for folks who have later season manure applications, if you're putting it out in September, even into October, and our soil stays kind of warm, your fall nitrate levels are probably going to be really high because our grass is not taking up very much around that time of year, but the soil conversion is still really high. So if you have high fall nitrate tests, consider what you're putting out at the end of that year. Maybe you're just putting out too much that time of year. It's not what you did early on in the year, most likely. It's what you did kind of near the end of the season. We also have to consider nutrient losses. I'm going to show this a little bit more here, a more detailed example, but volatilization, that's nitrogen that goes up into the air, is ammonia that you can lose. Denitrification, this is some of your nitrogen fraction in the soil. If it's really wet, high water table, saturated, it's going to convert and kind of blow off as nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide that you've lost it. We have leaching, runoff, mineralization, immobilization. There are many places you can lose nitrogen in a natural system, and we typically account for that when you guys get a nutrient balance from us. You don't have to think about that, but it's one of those things that if your grass needs 200 pounds of nitrogen for its production, you may have to put on 240, 250 to account for these loss wave pathways. And lastly, your crop type, of course, as you know, every crop type, no matter what you're growing, is going to require a different level of this. So you can't, if you switch even grass species types, you're going to have to redo things. You can't just put on the same amount every year just out of habit or ease of use. You have to start thinking about these things and adjust so you're not either shorting your crop or overdoing it for your crop. So let's think about a few things that in this agronomic rate situation, what are things that you can control in this equation? You can control the crop type and the number of acres you plant of that crop. We'll come back to why that's important. You can control some of those manure characteristics. If you have, again, you've got a lot of water volume you're collecting, maybe it's off this little slab area that you just haven't gotten around to covering, or a roof panel out. Fix those things, right? So that you have more predictability about what your manure concentration will be through the year. Or if you apply any type of technology, you've changed those things. So you can control it a little bit. You can control how much manure you put out and when you put out. Those things make a really big difference. Those are the two things that are in your control almost entirely, right? You make those choices. When you work with a custom applicator, I realize sometimes these things are slightly out of your control, that you're on their schedule, or you hope they apply the rate you ask. So it's just about really working with them and just making sure that they know what you want done out there. That's really important. The equipment that you use, if you pull a big gun or if you inject, the big gun is going to blow a lot of nitrogen off as ammonia gas. We do not want that to happen. If you inject, you're preserving that nitrogen. You're getting it right in that soil. So those two methods, if you just switch that once during the year, I like to pull the big gun early because my soil is kind of wet, and I top dress later, and you just apply at the same rate, you shouldn't. You have losses off of one that now you're shorting your crop at a time of year. Or if you're applying an injection-based method based on the same rate you would do a big gun, now you're over-applying. So even your technology that you use has different salvation or rates of nitrogen that you're going to lose. And your knowledge, right? The more you know, the more you can do out there. Things you cannot control. You can't control the weather. As much as I would love to be able to do that for you guys even, I can't do it either. So that's one thing. That means if it gets hotter than usual or colder than usual, maybe you have a yield increase or decrease. A yield change is huge to your overall balance through the year. That can right there put you under or over for the whole year. Something you can't control at that moment, but you can certainly adapt to. Remember that. Same, and that affects your crop uptake and yield. You can't control this, but you certainly can adapt to it. Maybe this year you couldn't irrigate that you have in the past. You better account for that because your crop yield's going to go down, or vice versa. Your crop yield's going up if you decide to irrigate a field this year you haven't done in the past. You have to consider that in increasing or decreasing what you put out for that plant. Your soil type has a huge impact here. So if you're on a sandy soil or if you're on a more silty, heavy soil, the nutrient retention and conversion in those two soils is really different. So don't even on your own farm, if you have both of those, apply at the same timing or the same rate. You need to apply even by soil type and adjust what you're doing out there. It makes a really big difference. And you can get out sooner to certain sandy, well-drained soil types. Others you're going to have to wait, so you just have a shorter application season to meet the needs of that crop. So there's a lot of adjustment. And lastly was that activity portion that I talked about. Our temperature, you can't, push those little bugs to work faster and vice versa. You can't slow them down at the end of the year. So this is something also out of your control that you need to adapt to. And I just want to show you a quick example of this. Hopefully I can yell at you versus pull this over. Many of you have had your WSP, you've probably seen in your dairy nutrient management plan, something that looks like this. This is really expounded here. What I want to show you, this is a tool that we use to create nutrient balances for your farm, let's say, if we work with you directly. And I just want to point out a couple things in here just to show you visually how some of the parameters I just talked about actually makes a difference. So on this example, we've got 50 acres of grass and 40 acres of corn. And we've got 5-ton grass and 25-ton corn here. And what you'll see down here is we have these balance. So this is saying that we're telling you this is how much manure you can put out to achieve 100% nutrient nitrogen balance. Not over, not under. This is just what you need. And I want you to watch how this is now how much manure you're putting out based on those parameters. So what happens if instead of 5-ton grass, we get 4-ton grass for a year? Well, we've still applied at that same rate, correct? But now you can see you are over by 25% in nitrogen onto that field. You are going to have a high fall nitrate value. You're going to have nitrogen leaching at the end of that season. Wasn't something you could control, let's say, that yield, but you certainly should have paid attention and adjusted your nutrient applications as it went down. The opposite is that if we had 5 or if we went up to 6-ton grass, now we've shorted it if you didn't change what you were doing out there. The same thing is going to happen with corn. If you just decide one year, I think I'm just going to change my acres. I think I'm going to plant more grass this year. I'm going to plant 60. I'm going to take, some of my acres out of this other one. Sure, you can still balance for your corn, but now you're totally out of balance for grass. I mean, you don't have enough manure. Why? Because grass needs a lot more nitrogen than corn does. So even when you just change your crop rotation in acres, your entire manure balance has changed. How much you have available even to put out there is totally different. That's something else. That's something that was totally in your control, but you had to account for it, and you've had a really big difference now. Even if we change something, if we're back to balance, and you decide, as I mentioned before, that you're going to change what equipment that you're using out there, you decide, you know, I think I'm going to pull the big gun, I'm not going to use a splash plate. What happens now is you're way under. So you've got a volatilization coefficient. And by the way, that's not a positive way to reduce your nutrient values on your farm. That's a no-no. Because that all blew off is ammonia, which is a significant air quality concern. The neighbors may not appreciate it. Our local environment certainly won't. So there are a couple of these factors. Now you can see this in actually a mathematical proportion, how this works. What is in your control? What is not in your control? So really thinking about those things. So I want to kind of leave you with a few things here in general manure characteristics, and what happens on your farm here is that when you're looking at what can I really think about control and not control, is your manure type, soil type, crop type, expected yield, those have to all go into your nutrient budget and your application rate. You can think about adjusting this every single application rate. Again, do your annual. I expect 5-ton grass, 300 pounds of nitrogen for the year. I'm going to split it like this. I'm going to get 60 pounds early season and go down to 40 late season because my grass doesn't need it. But as you go through the year then, you can do soil tests, you can do manure tests, please do forage yield tests as you go along to start adjusting that. Or you just know, like, it has been dry, my grass looks terrible, I need to back off on manure application. Or dilute it. If you still want the volume out there, which is great, add water to your manure, dilute it, so you decrease the concentration, but you're getting the water out there if it needs it. That's another nice trick you can do late summer and into the fall period. And then, you know, really thinking about adjusting that application, not just for your crop condition, but field conditions, weather impacts. Again, when your soil, if you have a field that your soil saturates a lot, you actually need a little bit more nitrogen later on because you're losing that organic nitrogen fraction through denitrification processes. So there's a lot of these really interesting factors that are happening, again, your control and then your not control on your field that you can do something about pretty easily. I also want to add a few things in here that can be very specific to your individual farm. And these are all the extra little bits and pieces about your restrictions and requirements. So in this agronomic rate piece, you need to actually, as you know, keep track of this as you're going through the year. You've got a rolling average that's going along with record keeping, how much you're putting out on which field, how you're adjusting. Your inspector is going to want to see that at the end of the year when they do their inspection or whenever that happens. But then if you also you have a CAFO plan, let's say, or you have a different type of nutrient management plan, or you have other things, just know that your record keeping requirements might be different. You might have different setbacks imposed upon you in some of those plans. You may have no application dates imposed upon you in some of those plans. You need to know those things and adjust for them. For instance, you know, I had that 40 acres of grass that I've planned for. If now you're required to have 100-foot no application setback because you're in a CAFO plan, you need to take those acres out of that. Your budget just went down for that field. You have to think about that. In our seasonal manure application setbacks, we've done this 10, 40, 80 that you don't necessarily have to account for because it really allows you to apply pretty darn close through the time of the year that you're really hitting them. So those are less of a takeout, but that 100-foot, if you're in that CAFO requirement, is pretty big and pretty impactful. So some of these other things too, it's just important to know food safety concerns with manure. If you're a crop that utilizes that when you can't use manure is very, very important to know. And then of course, any other state, local regulations, those should all be in your nutrient management plan, especially if you have a dairy nutrient management plan. We've tried to already know and account for all these things in your plan for you. But if you're kind of curious, you're not quite sure where you're at, you haven't had that thing updated for 10 years, you now just added a CAFO plan and you have a dairy plan, just come to our office and sit down with someone to help you go over that, or call your consultant and ask them about it. So there's a lot of different ways you can sit down and try to start working through this. So, and with that, I probably have time for a question, but I also realized I just went through like a 4-hour lecture in 30 minutes with you guys. That was a lot. It was just to like raise your interest and just get your brain thinking about a lot of these factors. What can you control? What can't you control? Those things you cannot control, how can you adjust for? Just remember that aspect of it. But any questions on this? Boo! All right, blew your minds on that. Well, you guys know where I'm at, so you can always come and talk to me, or whatever county you're in. I know we've got some folks from Skagit, Snohomish County up. You can always go into your district or go talk to your consultant. I'm sure Fred would love it if you guys all went to him, if you work with him and said, Fred, help me adjust for hot weather. I bet he'd probably punch me in the arm for that one. So that'd be great. But also know that there's a lot of resources on this handout that are there for you to do that. So with that, our next set of presenters is now going to actually give you some information about nutrient management practices that kind of relay into this, if you will. So we've got a discussion on cover crops and varieties. Again, something like a cover crop, well, I didn't even talk about it here. When you roll that into your corn rotation, it's a real positive, by the way. It's kind of like a sponge for excess nitrogen throughout the winter season, and then you get to harvest it as grass, which is awesome. So you're like a dual benefit, environmental and farm benefit on something like that. And then some of the other practices that are there that are available to you that are going to have great benefits, so you stop worrying about the storage and getting out there. Some other kind of neat things that we've got. So with that, it starts with a survey. Get your phones out while the speakers for the next sessions come on up. So which of these practices do you think is most protective of water quality? Cover crops, ditch covering, manure storage, application setback, vegetative stream buffers. You can just, whatever one you think, like what would be the top thing that I think is most protective of water quality? Interesting. Ditch covering. Well, that's pretty interesting, actually. I would have expected ditch covering to be the top one because it seems so obvious.
Well, now they just started saying it.
Oh, someone said, oh, that's what she meant. Actually, there's no right or wrong answer here. They all are protective of water quality. But it's interesting to see cover crops so high, which is great. It's a great transition.